TodayFM.
Savage Sunday with Bord Gosh Energy, helping you manage your business energy costs.
There's not many people who can, I think, fairly claim that they won a Eurovision for the country and also brought down a government. By extension, but nonetheless brought down a government. One of the people who can claim that is Shay Healy, who is our guest this morning. And Shay, when you look back at, we were just talking about it there during the break, the start of your career went off in, it seems, 9 different directions, because you were a cameraman, you were a musician, you were a journalist, you were sort of everything at one point.
Yeah, they used to call me a jack of all trades, which I kind of resented. I said, you have to amend that to multimedia artist.
Nice.
So I put that up on my website. That's the first thing, a disclaimer, and if there's any complaints, it must be accompanied by a €10 note. But I started in the Irish Press, would you believe it, my first job, and I was there for 2 years in the advertising features department doing the layouts. And then I graduated to RTE as a cameraman for 5 years. And I remember your mother coming in as a panellist on teenage programmes back in those days.
Would you work in the camera?
Being working the camera, yeah.
What's the connection between layouts for newspapers and being a cameraman? Because one doesn't usually qualify you for the other.
Well, they both had a visual aspect to them, you know, your perspective on the world. How you frame a shot on television is up to the cameraman's eye. And I always felt I had a good eye. Consequently, I had a couple of photographic exhibitions over the last few years as well. The one thing I've never been really good at is technology as such. So I don't ever strive to bring pristine work to the table. I bring atmosphere. Hopefully I bring a bit of warmth and a bit of humour.
Was that, though, not a time where you had to be quite high-tech to be a cameraman? Because that was still at the fairly early days of the technology and it was still fairly new and pioneering.
Well, I'm a great bluffer. No, I'll tell you who took me under his wing. Tom Hickey, the actor, took me under his wing. Tom was a cameraman, and he took me under his wing. But I remember that we had a year's probation, and at the end of the year, we were called in, and Tom Hardyman was the main man at that stage. Tom Hardyman and 2 others, and I sat down, and Tom Hardyman looked at me with a steely glint, and he said, "You have a reputation as a funny man. Why?" Oh, there's a question to hit me with. And I said, I suppose I said because I continue to be the class clown, you know, and my job is to entertain other people. And that's when I started writing songs when I was in the Irish Press. I used to write about the different characters. And then at Christmas I'd sing the song about them all. And they used to wait for it eagerly.
So how then, explain the move from being a cameraman to being both front of house and the Eurovision thing, because again, one doesn't seem to qualify you for the other.
Well, I did my time in TV and radio. I left RTE in 1967, and I did a show called Ballad Sheet, and then I did a terrible show called Hootenanny with myself and Hal Roach as co-hosts.
What made it so terrible?
Well, Hal Roach kept going around saying, "I'll never be Shay Healy's stooge again," and I was going around saying the exact same thing. But then during the 60s I became the folk correspondent for Spotlight magazine, which was the Bible of show business at the time. So I got immersed in that, and that whole folk thing carried me as far as the 1970s. And then in 71 I went to America for the first time. I came back for a couple of months and I went back and was there for 4 years. And I suppose I was...
Playing, writing?
Singing, entertaining. We were running a bar called Tara, which in Nashville, which was the principal amount of my time spent there. And I'd never had a real Irish bar there before. So it was tremendously exciting. We made up our own rules as we went along. And on Monday night, we'd pick a punter and make him the king of Tara and put a crown on his head and a scepter and give him a bullshit proclamation to read out. But that finished up about 1975. I lived in Cape Cod for the last 6 or 7 months, and that was a joyous experience.
Why did you come home?
My visa ran out, my working visa ran out, and they said I jumped jurisdiction, so I had to leave the country to come back in. So I said, right, I'll go home. I got home and we rented our house, and the people who were renting it had absconded. So we put in an American friend of my sister's on the basis that Americans are fairly meticulous and clean and they shower every day and do everything. We got home and found that the electricity was cut off, that he was brewing tea on the kettle over the open fire. And he collected Volkswagen parts and planks of wood. So the house was full of bits of engines. And so the mire of domesticity was particularly gripping at the time. And before I knew it, you're caught up in other stuff. So I fiddled around for a while, and I did another series called Hullabaloo with Joe O'Donnell, which was and Tom and Pascal. And then in 1978, when RTE2 opened, John McColgan,
a fellow cameraman.
A fellow cameraman, indeed. He gave me a job as doing the publicity for the new RTE2, which I did. And during the course of that, this is the funny part of it, during the course of that, I was doing, obviously, a reasonably good job. And a certain gentleman on the third floor didn't like me. He didn't like the cut of my jib, or that my hair was a bit long. And he decided that I should be fired. And then somebody said, well, he's doing a good job, we're going to look stupid if we fire him now. Well, then, we're not allowed to take on anybody new at the moment, so we have to see, is there a vacant position? And sure enough, there was. Press and Information Executive for all of RTE. So I was made the acting Press and Information Executive and it was in that capacity.
For the totality of the corporation at that point?
The totality of the corporation. I was the head of press at the Eurovision, and I was the Irish entry at the same time, which was highly unusual. I didn't think about it at all afterwards, but this generally go, relatives and friends can't enter the competition. But anyway...
But that means that if a journalist wanted to interview the Irish entrant, they had to ring the Irish entrant to set up the interview.
Something like that. It was even more bizarre that we went and we won. And when we came back to Dublin Airport, I had to have a press conference for myself.
Was it well organised?
Very well organised. Moe had a lot to do with the organising.
How did you come to get to be the entry? How did that occur?
The song took 4 years to write, because I started writing it in 1976. 1975, the year I came home, that November I started it, and I walked from the bus stop in Blackrock up to where I lived in Cross Avenue, and by the time I got home I had all the verses of the song, but I hadn't got the turn in the middle. And that took about another three and a bit years. And then I went in with Jim O'Neill, who used to be on...
Yes, it took 3 and a bit years to get, a 30-second turn?
Yeah. But it's the nuts and bolts. The whole song turns on that every time, So it was kind of critical, but it was a medium-tempo country ballad. And then Jim O'Neill and Brush Shields band came in, we did the demo, and that's what I sent out, a medium country thing. So,
and in that 3.5 year period, is it that you are racking your brains, or do you just shelve it and wait for inspiration?
Well, yeah, you revisit stuff all the time. I mean, you never stop polishing. There's a Turkish poet called Hikmet who said, the saddest thing in the world would be to die with that unfinished song, whereas I'm the exact opposite. I think you should be polishing away until your last rub, and then you're gone.
Were you totally happy with it when it was entered into Eurovision? Was it the perfect...
Well, Bill Whelan, fortunately, lives on the planet, and he got hold of it, and he put an arrangement to it that was just so good, and so much of its time, and then married that to the youthful Johnny Logan, who was very attractive, and then the song itself, which has stood the test of time. In fact, just before Christmas, I went out and did a couple of gigs. And because of the Parkinson's, I can't hold down the strings anymore. So I was kind of in despair. And I was with Don Maskell, and he said, look, I'll just play What's Another Year for You, you just sing it. I said, jeez, I'd never sung it in public, Don. So I did it, and it was like the 9 Inch Nails version of Johnny Cash, and people came up afterwards and said, we've listened to the song a lot, but we've never heard it before. We never heard the words and how stark it was. And I hadn't thought about that aspect of it myself, but I did know that over all the years, people keep approaching me and saying that song reminds me of my mother or my father or a special day or whatever.
Did you think that entering it in the Eurovision cheapened it?
No, because at that time, the Eurovision was a proper contest with everybody had the orchestra. And the arrangement and the performance were Whereas now with the backing tracks and these dance tracks which they build rather than record, it's a whole different discipline. And it would be nice to go back to the old format. They should probably break it up at this point and have a dance contest.
When you then came back, you're the Eurovision winner and you're the acting head of RTE's communications. Did you think, right, I can sling the RTE communication bit, retire on the royalties and become Stock Aitken and or Waterman?
That's me. Didn't work out that way. There were a couple of things that just happenstance. I mean, the week we got home from the Eurovision, my wife had an emergency hysterectomy. And so I was due to go off around Europe with Johnny Logan as a kind of ambassador for RTE at this stage. And she had complications. She got the wrong blood in the transfusion and she was very sick for a while. So when she recovered, I said, look, you take a year and do a bric-a-brac shop and just enjoy it, and I'll do the domestic stuff for a year, which I did. And then the royalties started rolling in after about a year. It takes a while for stuff to do. And I made some of the flashiest demos you've ever heard with some of the best musicians. And I tried really hard to get them out around the world, but placing songs is the hardest thing you could imagine because there are so many songs and so few singers. So I suddenly found by about 1985 or 6 that this is not looking great, I better do something else. So I had a musical called The Knowledge and I brought it off to New York. And I got a bite from a record company from A&M who said, if you can find another medium, like stage or film or whatever, we're in. Then I got a call from Joe Papa at the Shakespeare Theatre in Astor Place in New York. And he does a big production every summer in Central Park. So suddenly I was going to be this summer in Central Park, and the buzz happened, and they were ringing me, send us more scripts, more tapes, more scripts, more tapes. He'd see you on Friday, he'd see you on Monday, he'd see you on Tuesday. And then Kevin Kline opened in Hamlet on a Friday night towards the end of March in the Shakespeare Theatre.
There's a fish called Wanda, Kevin Kline.
Yeah, and he stiffed, and it closed down overnight. And Joe Papp disappeared, and I never found him again. But Joe Papp is dead now, and I'm not.
You mentioned your wife having had an emergency hysterectomy. Had you got kids at that stage?
We had 2 kids, yeah. And 2 boys. My eldest fellow's in Australia now. And my second son is a graphic designer. No, he's a senior graphic designer.
Oh, when did the promotion come through? The point then at which you found yourself with the Central Park deal having collapsed, did you think, back to RTE?
Well, eventually I did. I came back to Ireland and I wondered how am I going to get on here. And a program called Evening Extra came along. And Keano Hegarty, whom I didn't know really, took some kind of a mad flyer on me. And I had a week-to-week contract. But the first interview I did, I had a guy called Hank Wankford, kind of faux country and western star, ride up on a horse. And there used to be a great tree outside the canteen in Donnybrook, which is a lovely long branch. And I sat up in the branch of the tree and he rode up on the horse. So that appealed to Keano Hegarty. So I stayed there, I was with that for 2 years. And then I did a series called The Dublin Village. And that did quite well. But at the end of the 2 years of that, I went in and I said, I'd like to do something. They said, well, there's nothing for you. So I was despondently kind of making my way to the canteen when I was accosted by David Blake Knox, who said, I'm doing a new programme called Nighthawks. Would you be interested in doing it? And before we knew it, we were in a prefab out the back of some extension. But it was an amazing programme. We were left to our own devices.
And had an amazing effect, which I want to talk to you particularly about the effect that Nighthawks had after we take a quick break. We'll be back after this break with Shay Healy.
Today FM. Savage Sunday with Bord Gosh Energy. Energising your business.
Before the break, where we had left off was Nighthawks. Nighthawks, in case people haven't seen it, although most will have, it was effectively a fake pub with sometimes genuinely inebriated guests late at night on RTE.
You got it.
And in amongst all of the things that happened, one of the most striking things was the then Minister for Justice, the man who had been Minister for Justice, was on Nighthawks and said to you, effectively in essence, that senior members of the Fianna Fáil government had been aware that journalists' phones were being tapped.
That was about it. And we were heading off to do a gag with John Waters, who just brought out his book called Dancing at the Crossroads. And the gag we set up was that we travelled to Castlereagh and he passes on the road going to Dublin. And that gave us an excuse to go to Roscommon. And only because he has the whiff of cordite about it, he was an obvious man to go for. So we started into the interview, and I have a postage stamp of questions there. So I led him right up to the edge of the cliff. And he said, other people knew. And the interview concluded, the pub was jammed now, ram jam full. And he said, will you have a drink? I said, I will. And while we were waiting for the drink, he said, you know, in case you didn't notice, I said something tonight I never said before. I said, well, I didn't, but I do now. So he knew at the time that what he had done was going to be the downfall of Haughey. It was willful, yeah. Absolutely willful. And then we went up to a hotel for a few drinks afterwards, and during the course of that he said to me, Healy, he said, if I'm elected next time out, it'll be your fault. And if I'm not elected next time out, it'll be your fault. So I hot-footed back to Dublin. And hang on for a minute, during those drinks, did you say to him, why did you decide to announce it tonight? No. Probably because my acuity in the political area would not measure up to that kind of subtle nuance, you know. So when I came back to town the next morning, I rang Bruce Arnold and said, will you come out and have a look at this tape? Who was one of the journalists whose phone had been tapped? And he came out and he said, yeah, he just pulled the trigger. And at that point, I got onto every newspaper in town, and the only people that forgot to alert were the RTE newsroom. So hang on, let me get this straight. An RTE presenter has one of the world's great stories, and he was formerly head of communications for RTE, and the only people he doesn't tell is RTE. Yeah. Huh. Wasn't great, but... Was that Bruce Arnold's phrase, he's pulled the trigger? I can't remember, to be honest with you. But that was the thrust. In essence, that's what he said. And my own theory on it is that the country and western wing of Fianna Fáil suddenly saw a possibility here in the most unlikely forum to drop this bomb. And in other words, Albert Reynolds' supporters in some way, shape or form. Yeah, absolutely. And it wrong-footed all the journalists who've been chasing him for years. And it presented me as some kind of saviour of the nation, but in fact I think it was just a patsy. I was the club that was used to kill the baby scene. Were you glad to be that club? I can't say I was glad or otherwise, you know. I didn't have any great graw for Haughey. He was an interesting character though, and he did, as he said himself, he did some service to the state. He did some disservice as well. But I never met him. Had to be an interesting position, because it's one thing nowadays to talk about a Taoiseach losing office or being involved in a scandal, but back then Haughey was at the centre of so much and was so powerful that for you to believe I am at the very zenith of his... Yeah, it's like there's that Pruder film. It's there forever and it won't go away. So I may eventually, in my dotage, claim more and more that I saved this country from something. But I never met Haughey. I knew a lot of the politicians, and I was in a room with Malahide one night, a few years after that, and he was on the far side of the room, and I said, should I go over? And discretion was a better part of valor, and I stayed where I was and let him get on with his life. Did it make any difference to your career, that having happened? No, I don't think so. I think people knew I wasn't political by nature, and so there was nowhere to bring it usefully. I wasn't going to appear on prime time the next night. I was back to Nighthawks, and I was very happy because they were the 4 best years of my life. so far.
Doing Nighthawks?
Doing Nighthawks, yeah.
Why?
Well, it was a compendium of all the things that I liked. Oddball kind of music from people who wouldn't normally get it on television. Oddball guests, people who, again, would fly under the radar a lot of the time. And the comedy was inspiring. And I suppose the nice thing about it was a collective experience. It was the best, most creative bunch of people I've ever with. And everybody contributed. And any idea could come from anywhere. So, in that sense, it was just pure joy. I used to bounce into work. I'd be first in a lot of the time, the following morning.
How did it end? Why did they cancel the show?
I cried off. My dad died in January 1993. At the end of January, and I got very screwed up. And I had a bad couple of months after that. And I realised I was kind of tired. I was tired emotionally, I was tired physically. So I said, look, I'm not interested in doing next year. But
was it a breakdown?
Well, I walked through a breakdown for about the next 10 years, I'd say. I walked through it, though. And just a lot of panic attacks. And
with your dad's death as the catalyst for that?
I think so, yeah. They often say that one death would be significant in your life to throw you. I don't know why, because he was 85. He'd lost both his legs. I asked him everything I needed to ask him. There was nothing I didn't know, and I was quite ready to let him go. But you don't. These things just kind of happen. He was a great character, even without the legs. Like, I remember we had 2 Pekingese dogs at home, and he didn't like them. They were too fuzzy for him, but he used to say it was like a pair of slippers coming towards you. and on his 80th birthday, we threw a party for him, and he said to my wife, he said, I wish I had my legs today. And she said, you're sentimental for the day that's in it, Pops. He said, no, he said, I was just thinking if I had my legs to be able to give one of those Pekingese a kick in the arse.
Was it diabetes that he had? Was that
diabetes? Yeah, and smoking. Yeah, combination.
You said that was a sort of a 10-year walking breakdown from 93 through to
2003,
which would have been around when you got your Parkinson's diagnosis, wouldn't it?
Yeah. In fact, I probably had Parkinson's for a couple of years before I got the diagnosis. I'm 10 years now, so that would correspond about then. So things do dovetail when you look at them, you know. And I don't know how or why I recovered so quickly, but I just did. Somebody gave me a Xanax eventually, and then it was grand.
But I kept working. Xanax, or did it take a while for that to start?
It took a while, but I suppose the one good thing is that I didn't stop working and didn't stop writing, and consequently, I always had somewhere to retreat to.
I want to play a wee clip because you were on, I think, on Thursday of this week with Matt Cooper because of the march in respect of Parkinson's.
Oh, yeah.
This is some of the conversation between yourself and Matt in relation to Parkinson's.
I see people all the time in far into my house, and as I go close, they dematerialise. Sometimes I go down the middle of the night and there'll be 4 people sitting on my couch. And there might be an exotic costume, there might be a soldier and a woman on crinoline and an old hag with a black shawl. And I have to kind of say, scat, you don't really exist. You're just a drug. And
how freaky is that for you?
Well, sometimes it's amusing rather than freaky, you know. I'm certainly not scared by it, but I don't drive at night now because it's possible that a guy would suddenly rise up out of the middle of the road about 20 yards in front of me.
And you would stop.
And I'd stop.
Even though there'd be no need to stop.
Yeah.
During that discussion with Matt, you mentioned the thing of the difficulty of playing the guitar. You mentioned some of the tiredness that the Parkinson's cause, or the limits to how far you can go. Do you find it debilitating?
Well, debilitating is probably too strong a word yet. But unfortunately, the worst thing about Parkinson's is it is progressive. And even now, you can hear me starting to strangulate in my voice. I have to breathe and I get a bit of a stutter, and that happens when I'm under pressure. And doing a live broadcast with you, That's pressure. No. So I have to just accept these things are there. But I did 2 shows last year in the Sugar Club late in the year with the band, and everything went right.
Do you find that people interact with you differently because of the Parkinson's? Do they assume that because there are physical manifestations that it's a mental thing rather than a physical thing?
It's very hard to know because there's so little known about Parkinson's in the general community and how it affects people. Every single case is individual. It's its own tailor. And the drugs I have to take, I don't know anybody on the same drugs as I am, or the same amount. So it's a blunt instrument, really, trying to figure out how to treat it. But it interferes with me sometimes in terms of, I hate the feeling of feebleness or fatigue, but sometimes my arms are so sore in the morning I couldn't push myself onto my elbows. And that's just something. Pain is a very relative thing. It's now part of the mosaic of my life. I'm happy that that's where it is, you know. And it's background noise. It's like tinnitus that I have. If I listen to that all day, I go bonkers. So I tune that at the back of my head as well. So there's a lot going on in the back of my head and the front of my head at the same time.
You have, and is the ebook new out, by the way? You mentioned
I had 2 novels that came out in Dublin. The Stunt, about a singer, and it got great reviews. It didn't sell very well. And the follow-up to it, I brought him to New York for Green Card Blues. Got great reviews, didn't sell very much. And finally, I wrote the 3rd part, Nashville Nightmare, and the publisher didn't pick up on that one. So I was stuck with 2 parts of his trilogy. So I eventually wrote it and decided to self-publish and put a trilogy together called The Danny Boy Triangle. And it's up there on Amazon Kindle. You have to have a Kindle to read it. But,
and are we keeping our fingers crossed that this time it gets bad reviews and great sales?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what I did. We sold 1 book last week and 2 books this week. And I said to Ed Dara, who's working with me, I said, Ed, put a notice up there immediately. 100% sales increase in Shay's book in America.
Shay Healy, thank you very much for coming in. 53102 if you want to get in touch.
Today FM. Savage Sunday with Bord Gosh Energy. Supporting Irish business.
Text say Shay is one of life's gentlemen. His modesty and honesty and not taking any credit whatsoever for the Nighthawks Sean Doherty episode is a charming and self-aware breath of fresh air. Best of luck and best of health to him. And by the way, if you're interested in helping him increase book sales by another 100%, his website is shayhealy.com. So if you want to find out more about Shay or more about his books or download them or any of that, the address you need is shayhealy.com.
Today FM.
Savage Sunday with Bord Gosh Energy, helping you manage your business energy costs.